Well, I'm Greg Quinlan, and who I am, well, I'm a man who lived a good long part of his life, 10 years of my life, a decade, as an out and open homosexual. And how I got there was I grew up with Archie Bunker as the dad. And the only difference between Archie Bunker, and I'm assuming that most people know who Archie Bunker is, I'm finding out younger people, like most of those in the room right now, have no idea who that is, which really makes me feel very old. But the only difference between Archie Bunker and my father is that Archie Bunker had some mixed up belief in God, and my dad claimed to be an atheist. So what happened there was my born-again Christian mother married a non-believer. And so you know what happens when you do that, don't you? You get the devil for a father-in-law. So I had a strike against me before I was even born.
Wow.
And then the other difference between Archie Bunker and my father is that Archie Bunker was not physically violent. My dad was physically violent to me. He used to beat me up on a regular basis. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I used to be the one who got his wrath. Never knew why. And when I was 8 years old, I remember asking him, and it was a cold day like this, kind of wet and rainy, and I asked him, I said, "You hate me, don't you?" And he turns right back around and looks at me and he says, "Yes," as he took the Lord's name in vain and laughed, "I hate you." And that wasn't a revelation. It was like, yeah, I knew that. I knew that. Then I was 9 years old, I became a Christian. And it was the real deal. I was in junior church, and I felt that weight lift off my shoulder. I didn't know I had one until it was gone. But I didn't have the discipleship I needed. I had a hunger for the Lord. I loved Him. I wanted to serve Him. I was like a sponge on anything I could get a hold of. But at the same time, too, I'm still a 9-year-old boy. And then about the time I turned 10, a friend of my brother, who was the same age as me, found his dad's Playboys, and we started looking at it. Now, what we were looking at then is prime time tonight. But back then in the 60s, boy, I just told my age, didn't it? Back then in the 60s, that was really, tantalizing to little boys when we were looking at it. And then a boy who was older than me, we were looking at the Playboys, and I was introduced to sex. And at that moment, I got something I wasn't getting at home, and I wasn't getting at school, and I wasn't getting in the church. I got affection, I got approval, and I got affirmation. Somebody was touching me without hitting me. Somebody was talking to me without screaming at me and calling me names. Somebody made me feel like I had value and worth. Besides, it was sex, it felt good, there was physical pleasure in it, so I went back for more. So I called it a willing molestation. So at that moment, I become what James calls a double-minded man. Although I was a double-minded boy, I loved the Lord. I had a heart for Him. I wanted to serve Him, and at the same time, I'm doing this thing. And deep down, I knew it was wrong. Didn't know the why of it, but I just knew it was wrong. So as I go through high school and I get into college, and I was in school to become a minister, and somewhere around there, when all that was going on, I came back home because I ran out of money. It costs money to go to school even when you're a minister. And I went to become an LPN, which is a licensed practical nurse. It also stands for lousy paid nurse, LPN. But I went and became that, and I was so struggling with this sexual identity issue and fighting it so hard. It was either come out of the closet or commit suicide, because I had some fear of God, thinking that killing myself would meant hell. I came out of the closet. Now this is during the Bee Gees and John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever. Most you and I know what that is. Nobody else in the room has any clue. But it was the disco days. Some of you know what that is. So I was out doing all that kind of thing, and that was about the same time the AIDS epidemic hit, and I became a volunteer with Dayton, Ohio for the Dayton Area AIDS Task Force. And I was a friend to these guys who had found out they had HIV. And people were dying pretty quickly of it then. There was no treatment much for it. And at that point, these guys who knew about my Christian background, they knew I was going to be a minister, they were asking me questions like, "Greg, does God hate me? Am I going to hell? Would you read my favorite Bible verse at my funeral? Would you do my eulogy? Would you tell my son and daughter what happened to Daddy?" And I did those things. Pretty rough stuff. And in the process of doing all of that, a guy I was dating took me to this fancy reception of the Human Rights Campaign Fund, as it was called then. HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. And I was so impressed by this organization. They're very professional. The Human Rights Campaign is the largest gay and lesbian political organization in the country. It ranks as the 9th largest of all independent political action committees. And and chiefly responsible for the billions of dollars in AIDS research and support money that comes from the federal government. I still remember the commercial. So this organization taught me how to do grassroots activism, taught me how to read legislation, taught me how to lobby my elected officials, which basically is what I tell people. One of the largest organizations, one of the most respected organizations in Washington, D.C. taught me how to do, I'm now using for the Lord. So God can take anything and turn it around. But I was very involved in that organization because of AIDS epidemic, because we needed the money to fight this disease, this infectious disease. In that process, too, I'm getting my RN. And as I'm going through all of this, I'm also becoming very miserable with the lifestyle. I hated it. Very addicted to the sex part of it, you know, the porn and all of that, but very, very much disillusioned by the homosexual lifestyle itself. Relationships don't last, particularly among the men, very promiscuous, and even the guys who are in a relationship, they're never monogamous. That, you know, they call themselves committed, but it's never monogamous. So I really question what I'm doing and why. And because I was involved with that political organization, HRC, you know, and being a kind of a devoted person to whatever it is I'm doing, I would watch Christian television. You know, the 700 Club. I wanted to go through the TV and choke Pat Robertson. By the way, I've been on his show 6 times since I came back to the Lord. But God has a sense of humor. And then there was PTL, remember that? Jim and Tammy Faye Baker with the Rivers of Mascara. I watched that for entertainment. And then there's TBN, the lady with the pink wig, and she still got it, God help her. But I would be watching testimonies of people who'd left the homosexual lifestyle. And there's that double-minded thing again. I'm arguing with myself and yelling at the television. That's not true, that's a lie, I'm born this way. And deep down inside, I'm crying out to God. It's not true. I don't have to be like this anymore. I can change. And finally, I got to a point where I was watching a panel discussion on TBN of people who left the homosexual lifestyle. And then right around Thanksgiving weekend, 20 years ago, I made a phone call 2,500 miles away from where I was living in Dayton, Ohio, to California. And here, this is so ridiculous because I can't see this guy's face, and he doesn't even know my name. I don't know his name, and you know, he can't see my face, but I'm having a hard time telling him why I'm calling. So finally I blurted out, I'm gay and I don't want to be like this anymore. If there's any help, if there's any hope, I want to know. He chuckled a little bit. I got a little indignant, and he says, no. You're just the 7th or 8th person tonight who's called for the same reason. Not the only one that wanted out, and I'm still not the only one that wants out of homosexuality. So I said the sinner's prayer that night. I knew the sinner's prayer. I led others in the sinner's prayer. There weren't any bells or whistles, there weren't any fireworks, but I slept, I had peace. So I started looking for a church and wound up in an Assemblies of God church. And the pastor there was a little on the, how do I want to put this, cutting edge. So I'm sitting there and I'm not telling anybody what my issue is. And I'm sitting there in the pew and he yells out the word sodomite. And I go, and then he says it again, those sodomites. And it wasn't that I was offended, I was terrified. If they know what my struggle is, if they know where I have been, they're going to tar and feather me, put me out in front of the church with a big sign that says sodomite. So I'm scared to death. I said, God, you got to do something. And it was Ohio, and it was a terribly, you know, one of those, we have crazy winters out there, even worse than you have here. Yes. So it was, and I had just come back to the Lord, so I am one hungry dude. And they called off church because we weren't even supposed to be on the road. And there was a church down the road that was being built on the interstate, and my job had me up and down the road all the time. So I called down there, and this hillbilly answered the phone. And I said, are you having services this morning? Our church is canceled. Sure, son, we're having church. We always have church. Come on down, like the price is right. So I went on down and slip-slided in the parking lot. It was all ice. And I walk in there, and you can't make this stuff up. I didn't expect anybody to even be in the church because it was so, you know. Here's this church that seats about 2,000 people. There might be 300 people in it, so it really looked pretty empty. And the choir, there's a few people up there in the choir. And to my left, as I walk in, this fan-shaped church is a biker group. Now, I had no clue in the parking lot because they didn't bring their Harleys, in because it was icing. So here's a bikers group, leather, chains, the big fat wallet. Said God Squad on the back in Boston. And I thought, what have I walked into here? So they were sitting over here, and I sat over here. So I went over on this side. And the choir was great. They were moving and grooving. They were all choreographed. They even had, it was just, like I said, a bunch of white people trying to be black, and they were doing a really good job of it. And so, and the pastor preached, and I realize now that the hillbilly who answered the phone was the pastor of the church. But you know, sir, and I said, I've got to come back. This is too much fun. It's a little weird, but I got to come back. So I was the two-timer again, this double-minded thing. I had early service at 8:30 in the morning at the church up the road, where the pastor yelled the word sodomite. So when that service was over, I had 20 minutes to get down the road to the service there at 11 o'clock. Now the pastor's wife preached too. Her name was Darlene Bishop, Lawrence and Darlene Bishop, Solid Rock Church. And he just recently passed away, by the way. Pastor Lawrence did. He just passed away last September. And anyway, so Darlene was preaching. And, you know, I grew up in a church where women preachers were harlots and skirts. It just wasn't allowed. So, you know, my theology is being tested and challenged here. And she preached a sermon, you know, and she talked about how her baby brother died of AIDS. And I thought, okay, God, this might work. She made me understand something. Then she preached a sermon on hell, and you knew you didn't want to go. And then she said, one Sunday morning, she said, if a drug addict, if a prostitute, if a homosexual comes into this church to hear the gospel and that bothers you, we need your seat. I thought, hey, that'll preach. All right. So I'm listening to all this. So Easter Sunday comes around, and I had already committed to this church when the music minister there found out I could read music and carry a tune in a bucket. He had me in there to help the men's section. And the men's section were terrible. They were the worst, nails on a chalkboard bad. The women's section were fantastic. They were great, but the men, wow. I mean, they didn't know how to blend. Most of them couldn't read music, and there was one guy in there who thought he was the men's section all by himself. So, you know, it was a little bit of a challenge. But we made it, got through Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday night, they had a special speaker. She was a woman evangelist. Here we go again, another woman. Her name is Peggy Richards, and she since went home to her reward too. But she preached a sermon tailor-made for me. She talked about God the Father, a father's love, and that I felt like I was in the blender. You know, I was getting sliced and diced. And when she hinted at an altar call, I was up and, you know, down the aisle. My knees hit that altar, and I was a boo-hooing, snot and slobbering mess. You think I'm ugly? Now wait till I'm really crying. It's scared the smell off a skunk. And peel the paint off the wall. So I couldn't even, you know, speak, because there's, you know, the brothers behind me. Son, can I pray with you? I'm going, ah. You know, I couldn't even talk. But in my heart at that moment, I said, Lord, if you have taken me back and you are going to use me, I got to know, and I got to know right now, at that second. Son, there's a call on your life. Raise that boy up in the striped shirt. And they grabbed me by the shoulders, and they're putting me up, and through the tears, here she came. High heels, padded shoulders, and PhD, Pentecostal hairdo. You know, higher it is, the closer to God you are. Glory. Anyway, so there it was, and she's there, and that's happening, and she said, son, you've been through the muck and the mire. She pulled the mic away, and she read my mail. She knew where I had been and what I had done. And I'm telling you the truth, that woman had never been to the same gay bar as I'd been to if she'd ever been inside a bar in her life. So, and then she says, what the devil has trained you to do, God will use for his glory. And I already told you, you know, how that's worked out. So that's been sort of, and then after that, Christian Coalition of Ohio called me, and I got involved in Christian politics and doing what I'm doing now. And through a series of events, kicking and screaming all the way, the Lord brought me here to New Jersey. I argued with him about that. Why New Jersey? Why not Hawaii? But no, it was New Jersey. So here I am talking to you, and that's pretty much tells my testimony. This is where I've been, how I got there, and how I got here to New Jersey.
This is amazing. This is great.